Claude
There's
Destray.
no climate change.
No climate change, right. My name is Claude Destray. I'm a member of the faculty at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies, where I direct the International Human Rights Degree Program, the Human Trafficking Center, and the Center on Rights Development. I'd like to welcome all of you on behalf of the Conflict Resolution Institute, the John Evans Study Committee, and the Center on Rights Development to this Symposium on Sand Creek Massacre, Acknowledgement and Repair. For the Center on Rights Development, this is the final event in a year-long series on Indigenous rights, including our 4-day spring symposium held in April entitled Sovereign and Sacred, Indigenous Rights and Environmental Justice. It is fitting that this is the closing event for us, as it was the 150-year remembrance of the Sand Creek Massacre, coupled with the sesquicentennial of the founding of the University of Denver, that motivated us to explore the issues of Indigenous rights this year. I would like to begin by asking the Reverend Dr. George Tinker, Clifford Baldridge Professor of American Indian Cultures and Religious Traditions at Ila School of Theology, and member of the Osage Nation, to begin this symposium by offering a song asking our ancestors to join us.
Thank you, Dr. Tinker. My name is Tamara Pearson Destray. I co-direct the Conflict Resolution Institute here at the University of Denver, as well as teaching the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies. And I was also a member of the John Evans Study Committee here at DU. And I'd like to begin by welcoming you here today to the historic Raymond Theater in Marjorie Reed Hall, which is the alma mater building for the University of Denver. We're here today for a day of reflection on what happened at Sand Creek 150 years ago and the possibilities for acknowledgement and repair. I'd like to take a minute first just to remind you and ask you to silence your cell phones. And also that there's no food or beverages in this theater, so please respect that. And also, if you end up needing to enter or exit the theater during a session, if you could please use the back door, which will take you to the second floor entrance rather than the front door. We'll probably keep this closed as the day wears on and we end up with more people. So I'd like to acknowledge also the partnership of the Center on Rights Development and the John Evans Study Committee, along with the Conflict Resolution Institute, in making this possible today, and in the hard work of many students involved with both of those organizations who have made this possible. We will see them in and out. They have little name tags on, but you might want to acknowledge that to them as well, because we couldn't have pulled this off without all their help. I'd also like to acknowledge the support from the Chancellor's Office, the Corbell School Dean's Office, and the Henry Luce Foundation for making this possible today. There are many aspects of commemoration that we could have also included today. The Sand Creek Healing Run, the Sand Creek Massacre historic site in southeastern Colorado, the Northwestern University report. Given the collaboration between our two centers, the Center on Rights Development and Conflict Resolution Institute, that has been really what has guided our particular focus today toward the topics on today's agenda. And that focus is the processes for both providing justice and processes for restoring relationships. We do hope that you make yourselves aware of these other efforts at commemoration as well. We will also be videotaping today for the sake of archiving this event, and portions of today will be made available on the Center for Rights Development's website. And so that link is available on your agenda program. We are going to begin this morning with a review of the process and output of DU's Joint Study Committee as the major initiative around the massacre's commemoration here at the University of Denver. We'll consider the implications of the findings of various inquiry processes and what the possibilities are for repair. Then after a lunch break, where I'd encourage you to venture out in the rain, unfortunately, maybe it'll stop by then, to the various lunch options that we have both off campus and on campus. And then we'll return for an afternoon of reflection. First with our leaders of institutions who have engaged in processes to wrestle with the legacy of Sand Creek. And then with the descendants themselves, both of the Arapaho and Cheyenne and of John Evans. Hopefully none of us will leave today unchanged. Maya Angelou once said, "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again." I'd like to turn now to our first panel. This panel will be chaired by Dean Saita, who is a professor and chair of the anthropology department here at DU. He also directs DU's Urban Studies program. His work includes a focus on North American archaeology and labor history, and many know his work also on the 1914 Ludlow Massacre, which took place also here in Colorado. He will set our first panel task. Please join me in welcoming our first panel.
Thanks, Tamara, and thank you all for coming out this morning. And I just want to echo what Tamara said about extending thanks to CRI and CORD and all of the students who were responsible for helping bring this symposium together. It's really the first opportunity, I think, all year to publicly engage in a serious way with the John Evans Study Committee report, and I'm so grateful that we're doing it before the end of the academic year, so thank you for getting it in. We each have something to say about the report and what we learned from it and what we see as the larger implications of the report. We're going to try to finish all of that work by 9 o'clock so that we leave a half hour for hopefully some spirited Q&A and back and forth between the panel and the audience. One thing I wanted to say by way of introduction was, for me, the single most important thing to know about this report is that it was the product of a faculty-driven effort. The folks on this stage, combined with others, contributed over 2 years of a lot of blood, a lot of sweat, almost certainly a lot of tears to produce what I think is probably the most consequential and important piece of interdisciplinary and community-engaged faculty work to come out of DU in the entire 27 years that I've been here. And I don't think that's hyperbole, and I don't say it lightly. This report has all sorts of implications for how we should own our history as an institution and where we should go in the future if we're interested in forming a genuinely inclusive and intercultural campus. Our committee formed in February of 2013. At that time, some of us were aware that Northwestern University, also founded by John Evans, was already up and running with a study committee of its own, propelled by Native student activism on that campus and also faculty activism. At least a few of the original conveners of the DU committee, and I was one of the conveners, believed that the Evans-Sand Creek issue was one that DU should get ahead of as soon as possible so that we didn't appear MIA on our analysis of an event that happened right here in our backyard, especially since the university was celebrating its 150th year anniversary. I was concerned about our institutional reputation, and I don't think it's inappropriate for individual faculty to be concerned about institutional reputation. Believing the time was of the essence, we took the initiative to self-appoint and self-organize the study committee. And this is different from the way most institutions operate on these issues. Faculty committees like this are usually appointed by the administration. I suppose you could say that we thought, in this instance, it was better to ask forgiveness than permission. So we moved ahead with our work in the firm belief that we knew who the important people were to participate in this analysis. In February of 2013, I had been at DU 25 years, so I knew some of the on-campus scholars who would be central to the research effort and pulled them together first. And then the committee grew organically from there, which I think is another distinguishing feature of the John Evans Study Committee. We brought in external scholars like David Hallis, Tim Tinker, who you will hear from in another session, advised us and contributed to the report writing. And then I have to acknowledge my colleague in political science, Nancy Wadsworth, did heroic work as the eventual chair of the committee. I think that the process we followed for forming this committee enhances rather than detracts from the scholarly credibility of our reports. And I think the DU administration eventually recognized that and provided support as the work unfolded. They believed, I think, that we had the right people at the table. And so with that, I want to introduce some of the right people right now, all at once, and then each of them will have 5 to 7 minutes to talk about a specific element of the report. David Hallis is consultant to the Northern Cheyenne Tribe and former Colorado State historian, one of the most preeminent historians of the Sand Creek Massacre that we have in our fold. Nancy Wadsworth is Associate Professor of Political Science here at DU. She specializes in American political culture, social movements, and processes of reconciliation and forgiveness. I mentioned that Nancy took over as Evans Study Committee Chair in August of 2013, several months after the committee was convened. Richard Clemmer Smith is my colleague in the Department of Anthropology. He's a professor and an expert in indigenous rights, ethnohistory, and the peoples and cultures of the American Southwest and the Great Basin. Alan Gilbert is John Evans Professor at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies. He specializes in international relations theory, ethics, slavery and the American Revolution, and violence and nonviolence. Billy Stratton is Assistant Professor of English at DU. He's an expert in Native American literature and poetics, Indian captivity narratives, and eco-criticism. And then finally, Steve Fisher is Associate Professor with the Library Faculty in the Anderson Academic Commons and also a university historian. Steve served as a consultant on the committee, providing archival and primary source material related to Sand Creek. So with that, we're going to start with David Hallis to set the context here for Sand Creek and tell you what he sees as the significance and importance of this work, and then we'll proceed accordingly from there. So thank you all for being here.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Good. Before I begin, I'd like to introduce other members of this committee made up of the tribal representatives. Joe Big Medicine, Southern Cheyenne. Gail Ridgely, Northern Arapaho. Tom Meyer is consultant and historian for the Northern Arapaho. And Steve Brady Jr., whose father had so much to do with the creation of the National Historic Site. And Joey Littlebird from the Northern Cheyenne. They just made a long drive down here. And Henry Littlebird, Southern Arapaho. Our committee was different than the Northwestern Committee in that we invited tribal representatives to be a part of it. The Northwestern group did not. I thought that before we begin about the significance of the report, that some of you may not know the particulars of the Sand Creek Massacre. It occurred on November 29, 1864. 675 Colorado U.S. volunteers attacked a peaceful camp of Cheyenne and Arapahoes camped at Sand Creek in southeastern Colorado. The village was there because they had been told by the military to be there, that it was a safe place. They were flying an American flag and a white flag of truce. No harm would come to them. This was a peace camp. There were over 30 chiefs there, 33 chiefs. The troops that attacked were U.S. volunteers. They were not militia. They were under the command of the U.S. Army and the War Department. When that awful day was over, 230 Cheyenne and Arapahoes were killed. Over 200 were wounded. It was a village of about 750 people. The bodies of the dead were mutilated, their remains brought back to Denver and displayed 3 times at the Denver Theater in Denver. The United States conducted 3 different investigations. Those initial investigations determined that Sand Creek was a massacre. And by the Treaty of 1865, the government promised reparations, which have never been paid. After a time went by, the massacre morphed into a battle. And on the statue, the Civil War statue on the state capitol grounds, you will find listed among the battles fought by Colorado troops, the Sand Creek Massacre. Over 143 years went by before the United States again recognized Sand Creek for what it was. And that was the creation of the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site that was dedicated in the year 2007. The report that DU produced is significant because it acknowledges the massacre and those responsible. And those responsible were at the highest level in Colorado. Governor John Evans, the founder of the University of Denver, was instrumental in the massacre itself. And the report lays out his culpability to the fullest. John Shivington was the presiding elder of the Methodist Episcopal Church, who came to Colorado founding Methodist churches. He was the leader of this group of soldiers that attacked at Sand Creek. He's the man who said, kill them all, nits make twice. So I think that the Sand Creek disappeared from history. It was not taught in the schools. Only Indian people really knew about it. And yet it is one of the most, in all of American history, a true watershed. Because Sand Creek proved to the Cheyenne and Arapaho and to other Plains tribes that the United States was out to kill them all. Sand Creek is the symbol of that today. But there are, of course, many massacres of Indian people. But Sand Creek stands out. And this report, I think, stands out, and I think Dean was absolutely right. It's one of the great reports that I think that DU has ever put out. It was a common effort crossing disciplines and tribes. So it's hard to exaggerate the importance of this report. I hope we can talk more about it. Thank you.
Nancy?
Okay, can people hear me all right if I don't use the microphone?
For the sake of recording, it would be great if you would.
Oh, okay. I will then.
Hello. Okay. I went to print out my notes this morning, and of course, that's the day that the ink ran out on my printer. So I'm going to be looking at my cell phone just to kind of track my comments, what I wanted to say. I was asked to speak about the process of our committee work and the report itself, which is impossible in 5 minutes, but I'm going to take a stab at it. The first word that came to mind for me when I was thinking about this is complicated, and that's an understatement. The second word is organic. In a sometimes messy, always interesting, and I think ultimately fertile way. It was organic as opposed to imposed or rigid or perfectly systematic, but also as opposed to lifeless. Everyone here who was part of the committee will have their own perspectives on the process for sure. But I'll share what seems especially important to mention in a public forum like this, and then I encourage other members to share any aspects of the process you think are important. And for the audience to ask more questions, because I can only cover sort of the surface. I want to speak broadly about a couple of aspects of this. A lot was determined by the assets that we had and the constraints we faced from the beginning. In terms of constraints, primarily time. From the time that we got assembled, like fully assembled by late spring 2013, we had 18 months before the commemoration, and most people on campus hadn't even begun to think about the Sand Creek Massacre commemoration activities. We had a rather hastily but thoughtfully put together group of effectively volunteers who hailed from at least 8 different disciplines. No one was getting class release or any other institutional benefits for being involved. This was a volunteer effort of faculty and the students and the tribe members who were involved. We were starting from scratch. We didn't have much money. We did not have a lot of models about how to take on what we were about to take on. We had really almost no models for how to do this. Some universities have looked at the role of their founders in slavery, and very few have looked at issues related to Native history. And no one originally in our faculty group was an expert on the Sand Creek Massacre itself, though some in our group had written or taught on the subject and had considerable knowledge about it. In terms of assets, we had interested, committed people who were strong scholars. Our interdisciplinarity was a great asset. I think it came in very handy down the road, and we had a lot of interesting conversations that I wish we had recorded in some way. We did have some good advice about the relationships we needed to build and the places we needed to look. We had Native leaders on campus, student leaders who became, in many respects, our teachers. I think we followed the Native student leaders in terms of a number of things that they had great experience with and good strategic ideas about. We had people who knew where to look and could advise us as we hit rough patches, and I'll get to that part. We had some other groups around us in Denver who were wading into the same murky waters, and we had a willingness to go to some difficult places intellectually and emotionally. I am sure that everyone who worked on this committee had very vivid nightmares. I know that I did in the process, just especially as you learn the history of the Sand Creek Massacre. It's hard material. And also worth noting that from the beginning, we knew that the group we'd assembled would need to do much more than research and write a report. We had to figure out how to get our campus community ready for even thinking about the role of settler colonial institutions like ours in the land theft, killing, and ultimate removal of Native peoples who lived in Colorado. Our community at DU was only beginning to get educated about Sand Creek. The chancellor then, Chancellor Coombe, had only just begun talking about Sand Creek in his first year seminar dinners. Okay, so some other specific factors important to our process from my perspective. I'm just going to number them. First, we had initial support and advice from Dean Seda, who helped get the ball rolling in a very important way, but also from Chancellor Bob Coombe, who, it's important to mention, had opened himself up to becoming educated on the subject in the previous few years and had committed to finally bringing this material into the light of our collective recognition as an institution. He made sure from the start that we got connected to some key people, such as Otto Braided Hair, the historian Gary Roberts, and the second important person in the beginning of this, our former Colorado state historian and consultant to the Northern Cheyenne, David Hallis. David was not only extremely valuable for his knowledge of the history of all of this and the histories and the cultures of Cheyenne and Arapaho communities historically, but perhaps even more importantly, his long-standing and honored relationships with the tribes was critical to what we did. He guided us in very important ways. So secondly, we invited the involvement of descendant communities early and centrally in our process. Thanks especially to David, but also to Chancellor Coombe, who made us aware of the importance of this from the beginning, and to Provost Greg Kvistad, who made it possible for us to do this financially. So descendant representatives were official members of our committee from the get. We hosted them at our meetings once per quarter to talk about what we were trying to do, and to solicit their invaluable wisdom and input about what might come out of this, what this process might mean. What do we have opportunities to do here? So while they didn't participate directly in the writing or research of the report, they very much paid attention to it and our process and shared their perspectives on why facing history mattered. And this perhaps helped us avoid some major and common missteps by which other institutions had stumbled. Also, working with the descendants gave us a chance for meaningful relationship building and learning. We met a lot of other people through working with the descendant communities. And when you work with descendant communities, the descendants of settler communities, this inert thing called history gets very real very quickly. Honoring intergenerational knowledge will or should completely change the way non-native scholars approach these subjects. And through these meetings, we gained perspectives that changed the way we approached some ambitious and perhaps premature ideas we had brought in at the beginning. There were some things that there was a lot of interest in doing, like setting up a campus memorial in time for the commemoration of the 150th anniversary. And it was through working with descendant communities that we learned that that was a premature initiative. We want to do that, but we have to do that in the right way. And that's going to be a longer term process, so we set that aside. In terms of the report itself, like most kinds of collaborative academic research and writing, it is a sausage-making process in some sense. You don't necessarily want to know what that looks like, but we bring different interests, different experiences, different disciplinary perspectives and approaches, different viewpoints and contributions to the writing. And for a while, I would say in our first several months, as we were going into the archives, gathering information, educating ourselves more broadly, we were on a learning curve, and all of this became kind of fragmented and swimming in space and all over the place. And then there was a time when it began to come together. Some of the things we did in our process included a visit early on in September of 2013 to the massacre site, with a handful of Northwestern scholars, and so with guidance from the National Park Service and experts and historians. We spent time in the archives, almost all of us at different points, at different stages, either online or in the library or in the Historical Society. We had Gary Roberts, historian Gary Roberts, who's probably the single historian who knows the most about the Sand Creek Massacre and very much that surrounds it. With Gary and David's help and teaching, we had guidance along the way. With Steve Fisher's help in tracking down references, we got to work. We had all group discussions about our approach and analysis, and definitely some conflict and disagreement. Any one of us individually might have written a different report. We would have brought different skills and interests to the report. Working collaboratively, of course, created something different than any one of us would have produced alone. There was a moment where we decided in June, or May or June of 2014, that we decided to shift our focus on where we disagreed from the Northwestern report, which had come out in May, rather than to go over all the same ground and sort of produce the same linear format of a report. We decided to concentrate on where we agreed that the evidence substantiated some different conclusions, and to focus our report on that. We didn't want to set that up in an adversarial way, but we thought that would be the most effective thing to offer audiences here and in Illinois and around the globe, so that people could read both reports side by side and draw their own conclusions. And Alan's work synthesizing some of the mountains of historical detail, and then Richard's comparative instincts from his knowledge of other similar events in the same region at the same time. I would say those two streams really helped us begin to build out an analysis. Then I functioned as a sort of managing editor. I'll never forget the weekend I spent in the Denver Public Library mapping everything out onto a million little cards and working it into a new outline. Billy's knowledge of Indian U.S. law and his oversight were very critical to this. Billy's knowledge of, and Teague's knowledge of patterns and techniques of settler colonial power, of native cultures, of the way that the worldview of settler colonialism lent itself to the kinds of decisions that John Evans made over a series really of a 2-year period that our report focuses on, were absolutely critical. And so in some ways, I can remember acutely many of the stressful and kind of exciting moments in the writing of the report, and at the same time, it's a blur because we were working incredibly fast, incredibly carefully, overnight with kind of different sort of pressure than you have when you're working on an academic article and you know that it can go through lots of iterations. We tried to check it against a number of sources and outside readers. And then we had a second subset of our committee work on drawing up the recommendations. And perhaps we can talk about that after others have spoken. One last thing I want to say is that because we knew we had to do more than write a report, but we also had to build capacity on campus for even beginning to approach the commemoration, we had 3 different subcommittees on our committee. One looked at precedents, how other universities have tried to address the past and what reports they produced. One was in charge of exhibits and events, and one was looking at sort of at the report itself. And so we did a number of things beyond the report in the run-up to the commemoration. So that's a sense of process overall. There's a lot more I could say, but hopefully it gets us started.
Well, one of the
It'll just take a second before we get
second.
Yeah.
One of the questions was what was John Evans' role in all of this, and what should it have been? John Evans was not only governor of Colorado, he was also superintendent of Indian Affairs for Colorado. This was not unusual in Western states, that the governor and the superintendent of Indian Affairs were the same person. So one question was he doing or not doing things pretty much as would be expected of any old governor and any old superintendent in the West? And the answer to that is no. He stands out as unusual, and here is why. If we compare him with 2 other superintendents of Indian Affairs, and those are James W. Nye of Nevada and James Dwayne Doty of Utah, we find that their approach to a similar set of circumstances was very different. Now, the set of circumstances was conditioned geopolitically by the Overland Trail, the transcontinental road, which began, the western part of it began at the western terminus of the railroad in Missouri. And it went through Nebraska, Kansas, Nebraska, and Colorado into what is now Wyoming, where it split into another couple of trails, the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, going through Idaho and Oregon and Nevada. So at the start of the Civil War, the United States, the Union, wanted to make sure that that road was clear through the Union territories, that there was not a chance that the Confederates could capture that road, because silver and gold were coming out of California and Nevada into the U.S. Treasury, and supplies were going the other way, of course, out to the West Coast. So the U.S. government wanted to make sure that that road was safe and secure and clear. Now, the road for between 1840 and 1860, it was the major thoroughfare for anybody traveling west. There was another one that went south, but this was the major one. And there were altercations between Native peoples and settler colonists traveling on that road, as well as the Pony Express and mail carriers and so forth. Between 1840 and 1860, according to John Unruh in his book, The Plains Across, he says that there were about 400 altercations, no, I'm sorry, not 400 altercations, 400 settler colonists who were killed as a result of altercations with Native Americans, and about the same number of Native Americans killed by the settler colonists. So, because, in fact, these folk were traveling through Native American territory without really any permission to do so. Now, he also says that 90% of those conflicts, of those deaths, occurred west of a kind of a watershed place called South Pass. That is in what is now Wyoming. It was then territory of Utah. This was in the territory of the Shoshone and Band, which means in 20 years, there were only a few dozen settler colonists who lost their lives in the portion of the road that went through Cheyenne, Arapaho, Sioux, and Kiowa territory in Kansas, Nebraska, and Colorado, which means that the portion of the road through Colorado was one of the safest portions. So, in 1862, a mandate went out to 3 territorial governors, James W. Nye, James Blaine Doty, who was then simply superintendent of Indian Affairs in Utah, and later was appointed governor as well, and to John Evans. And this mandate was make peace with the Indians under your jurisdiction. Well, I won't go into a lot of details, but Doty, who had responsibility over a huge territory, Utah was much larger than it is now, including parts of what are now Wyoming and Idaho and Nevada, as well as Utah. He had an enormous responsibility. And this was made even more salient by the fact that in January of 1863, a massacre of Numa people, Shoshone people, at Bear River, Utah, resulted in the murders by U.S. troops of at least 224 Native people. Probably the total is closer to 400 because the officer in charge, Colonel Patrick Connor, stopped counting. He said, I was on the battlefield, but I just stopped counting because it was cold and I just stopped counting. Somebody else later came to the battlefield, counted the corpses, and counted 368. So this massacre was, even in terms of body count, bigger than Sand Creek. So Doty had to contend with the remnants of these folks who were not exactly favorably disposed to the U.S. government. But he ended up negotiating between the spring of 1863 and the fall of 1863. He ended up negotiating 5 treaties, 4 of which were ratified immediately. The other was ratified some years later. 5 treaties with Shoshones and Bandits. 5 peace treaties. In contrast, John Evans scheduled 1 peace treaty council, which was a failure. And we'd say maybe it wasn't his fault, because in fact, there were a number of factors. Some of the folks were out hunting bison. Others were flat on their backs, sick with disease, probably diphtheria, cholera. But he never tried to reschedule that Treaty Council. This was in August of 1863. I will quote a letter from the Commissioner of Indian Affairs to Evans, July 16, 1863. I hope you will find it possible to arrange with Cheyennes and Arapahoes that have not signed the Treaty of Fort Wise of 1861 to do so and put them together or make some other arrangements that will be just to them and satisfactory to the whites. A year later, in 1864, he again writes to Evans and says, as Superintendent of Indian Affairs, it is your duty to hold yourself in readiness to encourage and receive the first intimations of a desire on the part of the Indians for permanent peace. So if we compare John Evans, Superintendent of Indian Affairs, with a mandate to negotiate peace with the Indians in a part of the Transcontinental Road, which had seen far fewer altercations than those to the west. If we compare John Evans with James Duane Doty and James W. Knott, two territorial governors, superintendents of Indian Affairs in Utah and Nevada, dealing with very similar conditions and circumstances, they were very successful in establishing and negotiating peace with the Native Americans. John Evans was not.
The Northwestern report is pretty good historically. It draws some conclusions and has some language which, except for the motivation of trying to protect John Evans from a point of judgment, is inexplicable. It says of his 1884 interview with H.H. Bancroft that it is nothing short of appalling. In that interview, Evans says that hostile Indians were discovered at the Sand Creek camp. Had that been so, it would have been, in Evans' mind, a justification for, and this was a word at the time, extermination. But he never claimed it was so in the 1860s, and there is no evidence whatsoever that it was so. And there were 3 federal commissions that looked into it in 1865. And Chivington was beyond the reach of the Army. And they didn't just, out here in the West, arrest people for murder, for the murder of children, for the mutilation of women, for the mutilation of men. But John Evans was asked to resign, as was Indian Commissioner Dole. And it saddens me, actually, that in Dole's case, you can make, as Richard began to, a very powerful case that he was an honorable person who did the right thing in many cases, and that the judgment against him was unjust. And he isn't mentioned in these reports much. Against Evans is the opposite, and I wish we were a little less so. John Evans was a great founder of white institutions, and he was an abolitionist. He did not like slavery. The paradox of the American Civil War was it was against genocide toward black folks, and it continued the genocide from coast to coast against indigenous people. And when Evans was dealing with the Cheyenne Iraq, he became the most outspoken person. This is Gary Roberts' point in his review of this, which he sent to both candidates, for war. he said that there was a general combination of Indian tribes from late 1863 on, and wrote hysterical letters about the powerlessness of Colorado, the overwhelmed a sea of Indians, and everybody's going to be killed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all through 1864. The Northwestern report says, I think idly, I don't even know how historians sign off on such a thing, that there were a number of people who were responsible for creating the atmosphere in which the 3rd Regiment was recruited, of civilians here to go murder people at Sand Creek under the aegis of the U.S. Army. There is no one else at all comparable to John Evans, and Gary Roberts sent a memo, which is very powerful and you can read on the website, to Northwestern and to us, and it traced the whole show. And if you read our report, we underline how unique Evans' responsibility was. One of our criticisms of the Northwestern report at the end is that they say that rightly that Evans was unfeeling and unconcerned with the lives of Cheyennes and Arapahoes in his interview with Bancroft and after the killings. But they imply that he wasn't so responsible before. Actually, what the history says that they report is at Camp Weld, Major Wynkoop, who had been, as he said, one of the exterminators under the leadership of Evans and Chivington. And that meant that when Black Kettle sent 3 messengers, picking one on, to establish a chance to come in, as Evans had bid, Wynkoop thought his soldiers should have shot them. He criticized his men for bringing them in. And he, upon talking to them, said, actually learned, he said, they have a more profound civilization than we do. I was really blown away. And he said, I had been one of the exterminators, and I left the party of the exterminators. Northwestern refers to Evans as a moderate. If you think there are moderate exterminators, good luck. That's not a spectrum I'd like to be put on myself. Probably the worst single sentence in the Northwestern report is the following. John Evans issued 2 statements, proclamations as governor. The first was on June 27th, where he said, friendly Indians can come to the following named camps, including the Cheyennes and Arapahoes, to Fort Lyon. All who remain on the plains are enemies, and he basically declared war. I'm not sure our report notes this as should. Gary Roberts pointed out to me that he gave no time frame for the indigenous people to come in. And when people came in, they were shot at first. And it was extraordinarily difficult for Black Kettle to arrange to come in, and with great risk. He sent out his messengers, and Wynkoop came with a small group of troops to 2,000 Cheyennes and Arapahoes, who almost attacked him, but fortunately Black Kettle stopped this. They had an arrangement, and then he brought the leaders of them to Camp Weld, and they tried to make peace with Evans and Chivington. So this first proclamation was very bad. The second proclamation, August 11, says, any Coloradan or any group of Coloradans, get your guns and shoot any Indian you meet on the plains and take their property. This was very hard for Evans to try to explain afterwards. This is a vigilante document. He didn't even have military authority, by the way, formally, although he spoke as a military leader always. The Northwestern report says critics have condemned the vigilante tone of the second proclamation. They have condemned the vigilante tone of the second proclamation, but it had little effect. Well, you will note that there is this objective, semi-objective observation, which does not disagree with the critics of the vigilante film, because you have to be insane to read that. You know, it's like talking about lynching in the South. And saying, well, you know, the critics have said, there's lynching. But it had little effect. Well, actually, the 3rd Regiment was all recruited by John Evans after these hysterical appeals to Washington. And he was to kill, the Northwestern report says that he wasn't interested in attacking women and children, all hostile Indians on the plains, and he forbade, including with the Arapaho Roman knows who he dealt with, bringing the children and women of hostile Indians into camp, into these camps. 4 times he says that much. So I'm afraid that what was done at Sand Creek looks pretty much before the fact and after the fact like John Evans set it up. John Evans was unique in setting it up. If Chivington acted independently, which he may well have, he was a big, powerful, monstrous man. Crazy as a bedbug and a murderer. Evans created the conditions. And the worst thing is he never apologized at all for it, not once. Never. If you were to look at this legally, as Judge Greg Hobbs said, he would say there is circumstantial evidence of a conspiracy. And were he to be tried under modern American law, there's very little question that Evans would be such a conspirator. I disagree with Gary Roberts about one thing. He says Evans was a team player and Chivington was a lone wolf. I had thought that Evans was a victim of the banality of evil, and then I read these interviews. And the interviews are pretty shocking because John Evans never did a thing in his life that he believed. And it is very likely that John Evans would have become president of the United States, which I think probably he hadn't viewed, but for the fact that he got overwhelmed in the pushback like this. But his plans were not completely irrational. And I don't know what level his contact with Chivington led to the thing. Gary says, well, he probably knew that the Sand Creek people might be swept up in it. He didn't know about the details of the attack. The Northwestern report dishonorably says twice at the beginning of its conclusion, there is no direct evidence, and repeats this, that Evans set this up. That's of course true, but unless you believe that there's no such thing as a conspiracy and there's nobody who's Machiavellian, and this guy was pretty clever, I would just say it's a really important thing to look at. And I want to just announce one more thing. I'm an Evans professor, and we Evans professors have been discussing this, and several of us are going to send a proposal that the name Evans professor be changed to Daniel L. Ritchie professor.
The what?
Daniel L. Ritchie professor. Because we wanted, and I think the trustees will want to keep the Colorado significance to the name, but we want a name for the 21st century which has honor. And there will be no repair of everything that's done for John Evans. I think John Evans should be honored for his contributions to the university. I think Founders Day is a very good occasion. I am not at all clear that we shouldn't say the truth about John Evans. Northwestern claims to say the truth. It wants to say the truth. It doesn't quite say the truth. Our collective effort goes a little further.
No.
Thanks to all the panelists so far and the organizers of this event for bringing us all together to talk about this historic report, but the events that the report tries to shed light on. Dr. Esteta introduced me as an expert in Native literature, and I would rather say, yeah, that is correct. I teach Native American literature in the English department, but what I teach is storytelling, and what I teach about is storytelling. When we talk about literature and what that is, literature from a Western point of view is a specific discipline and sort of division of discourse. From a Native point of view, and he also talked about interdisciplinary, and so did Nancy, but from a Native point of view, storytelling is inherently interdisciplinary. And so you have what we would call literature, i.e. fiction, poetry, but also history, also spiritual knowledge, basically knowledge in its totality and holistic being. And so the approach that I took in terms of my contribution to the report had to do with that sort of perspective on what storytelling was about. David Hallis spoke very passionately about history, and he talked about Sand Creek being disappeared from history. Well, what that means is historians allowed it to disappear or made it disappear. There are agents involved in history. History is not an abstract idea. And so if things are not known about history, that is because people most likely and consistently and intentionally decide to leave things out of history. And so those are some of the things I was thinking about when I first came to DU back in 2010. And one of the most striking things that I noticed immediately upon coming to this campus was an undeniable absence of Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Native perspectives in the ruins of historical representation. And what I mean by that is the history, the historical narratives that have been perpetuated not only in Colorado, but in Denver, but in the United States. And so I would start asking my students. I would talk about Arapaho and Cheyenne land. I asked them if they knew on whose land DU was founded. I asked them if they knew anything about the peoples whose land this still is, as I consider Arapaho and Cheyenne land, as Fink was speaking about earlier. And to my surprise, but maybe not surprise, there would be maybe 2 or 3 students out of 30 or 35 that had any idea what Sand Creek was, and could describe in any detail what happened at Sand Creek. And then what do you do with something like that, right? Why did that occur? How can someone be admitted to an elite university and not have any idea about the history of the place where they're at? To me, it's mind-boggling. But from being in American Indian Studies and Native literature for the past over 10 years now, it's on another way, it's not surprising to me. And so part of my effort since I've been here has been to educate my students about these events and bring that history through literature to them. I just had a student a few weeks ago actually write in a journal. He said, I'm questioning why I never knew about the Sand Creek Massacre, but I'm also questioning why I'm first learning about this in a literature class. And I guess that's not a question for me to answer, but it's a question for people who call themselves historians and those who are responsible for teaching that history. Obviously, for this student, they failed. In terms of the report itself, one thing I was responsible for was writing and editing the section related to treaties, the Marshall Trilogy, American Indian law and policy, and how that was relevant to John Evans's role in the affairs. And as Richard already summarized, it has to do with his responsibilities not only as governor, but as the superintendent of Indian Affairs, which means he was responsible for the enforcement of treaties. So it's not only about negotiating new treaties. He was the official who was responsible for enforcing the treaties that were already in place. And there were treaties in place, and there were treaties that had recognized the legal claims of Arapaho and Cheyenne people, also you people within the territory of Colorado to the lands that they had lived on for centuries. The other part of the story that I would like to stress is this notion of what history is, right? I just talked about history as a discipline, history as a discourse, but history is different from facts. And that's sort of what we're talking about and what's being omitted. That's what I think Alan Dover was getting at when he was discussing Northwestern's report and the lack of evidence that they could find. But the evidence from a historical point of view is not necessarily based in storytelling. It's based in documents. And so the idea or the assumption is if there is no document, if there is no letter where John Evans or someone else states that this was done for A reason, B reason, C reason, well, that means there's an opening there for innocence or to escape any kind of responsibility or blame. The one thing that may be regrettable, but not regrettable because necessarily the failings of us as a committee, but maybe in terms of the amount of time that we had to write the report, is the lack of specific Native stories within the report itself. The Arapaho and Cheyenne people and their ability to tell the story, tell the history from their own point of view. And that's a difficult thing to assess because we're talking about histories that are not typically written down, but histories that are passed down from elders to their children, one generation to the next, where those stories maintain and those stories live. But just because those aren't written down doesn't mean there should not be a space for those stories. We're trying to give that space here, and we've given that space in terms of our consultations with Gail and other Arapaho and Cheyenne people, and we're going to continue to do that. But what that takes for us as a committee and what that takes for you as an audience is to be receptive to listening to those stories, not being concerned with always having to find the document or find the book where those stories are told, but actually getting out in communities and talking to Native people and listening to what their points of view are on these subjects, but also how the past, how events that happened over 100 years ago, 150 years ago, affects to this very day. And so that's an important thing to think about in terms of what history is, what storytelling is, what literature is, what the legacy and of the events of Sand Creek is, but also the responsibility of an institution that's dedicated to education, right? Education that's supposed to reinforce and promote the public good. And so healing, I think, is part of that public good. And it's an effort that maybe didn't begin with this committee, and it won't end with this committee, and it needs to be an effort that is always at the forefront of the University of Denver going forward. And that's what I hope that we are able to do and spurn not only between each other, but maybe inspire in you to think of these events in a different way, or think of them maybe for the first time and want to know more about them, not just from our perspectives, but from an Arapaho, Cheyenne, Native perspective. Thank you.